while millions of American families were gathered around their dining room tables, expressing gratitude for their blessings and carving into perfectly roasted turkeys. Several horrifying acts of violence unfolded that would forever stain the holiday meant to celebrate togetherness, unity, and thankfulness. But what you're about to discover goes far beyond what you could ever imagine about family gatherings gone catastrophically, unimaginably wrong. Let's begin with the Della Roche family annihilation. In the quiet, unassuming town of Montvale, New Jersey, a picturesque Bergen County community of approximately 5,000 residents where absolutely nothing of consequence ever seemed to happen, the De La Roche family appeared to be the epitome of middle-class American normalcy and suburban contentment. They were the kind of family that neighbors would point to as an example of hardworking values and traditional family structure, the kind that participated actively in community events, whose children were involved in Boy Scouts and school activities, and who maintained a well-kept home that contributed to the neighborhood's overall aesthetic appeal and property values. Harry De La Roche Sr., a distinguished World War II Navy veteran who had served his country with honor and distinction during one of history's most consequential conflicts, had successfully transitioned into civilian life and established himself as a respected supervisor at the Ford Motor Company, where he had worked diligently for many years, earning promotions and the respect of his colleagues and subordinates. His wife, Mary Jane, had an elegant grace and refined beauty that came from her earlier years as a professional model, and she had channeled those talents into becoming a skilled sewing instructor who shared her expertise with other women in the community, hosting classes in their home and at the local community center where she was well regarded for her patience and attention to detail. But beneath this carefully maintained veneer of suburban perfection existed a darkness so profound, tensions so deeply rooted and toxic, that they would eventually erupt in the most catastrophic and irreversible way imaginable. Harry Sr. was known for implementing a strict, authoritarian household management style that bordered on military discipline, running his home with the same rigid, unyielding structure he had learned during his years of naval service. He insisted that his sons participate in organized sports, particularly baseball, even when they showed absolutely no interest or aptitude for athletic competition, forcing them to endure practices and games they found torturous and humiliating. His frugality reached levels that some might characterize as extreme or even miserly, and he maintained a substantial collection of firearms in the home, including multiple pistols and rifles, which he kept readily accessible rather than properly secured away from his children. The eldest son, 18-year-old Harry De La Roche Jr., born in 1958, was a young man who had struggled throughout his entire adolescence and teenage years to find his place in a world that seemed determined to reject him at every turn. Socially awkward and painfully self-conscious in ways that made normal peer interactions feel like navigating a minefield of potential humiliation, he had endured relentless bullying throughout his school years, cruel pranks that left him emotionally scarred, physical abuse that occasionally sent him home with bruises and bloody noses, and the kind of social isolation that can leave permanent psychological wounds on a developing young person's psyche and sense of self-worth. His interests gravitated toward rock music, particularly the harder, more rebellious sounds that his parents found objectionable and inappropriate, and he had begun experimenting with marijuana, which put him at odds with his father's zero-tolerance policies regarding drug use. He also developed a passion for car racing and automotive mechanics, spending hours tinkering with engines and dreaming of the freedom that came with the open road and the raw power of a finely tuned machine. In 1976, following poor academic performance and behavioral issues, his father had forcibly enrolled him at the Citadel Military Academy in South Carolina, a notoriously demanding institution known for its harsh disciplinary methods and brutal hazing rituals that had broken many young men before him. At the Citadel, Harry Jr. faced absolutely brutal treatment from upperclassmen who seemed to take particular pleasure in tormenting the awkward, vulnerable freshmen who didn't fit the mold of the typical military cadet. The hazing he endured went far beyond mere inconvenience or minor embarrassment. It included severe physical beatings that left him bruised and battered, psychological torment designed to break down his sense of identity and self-worth, and incidents that may have resulted in actual concussions and traumatic brain injuries that could have had lasting neurological and psychological consequences. His vision problems, which had already prevented him from attending his preferred military schools, only added to his struggles and made him an even easier target for those looking for someone to victimize. The middle son, 15-year-old Ronald, known affectionately as Ronnie, presented a completely different profile from his awkward older brother. He was athletic, naturally charismatic, and genuinely popular among his peers at school and in the neighborhood, possessing the kind of easy social grace that had always eluded Harry Jr. despite his desperate attempts to fit in. However, Ronnie also demonstrated clear signs of rebellion against parental authority, frequently clashing with his father's iron-fisted rules and expectations, and according to various accounts from friends and classmates, he had become involved in selling marijuana to other teenagers in the area, a dangerous activity that put him at significant risk and created additional tension within an already strained family dynamic. The youngest member of the family, 12-year-old Eric, represented innocence in the midst of this dysfunctional family structure, a child who had done nothing to deserve being caught in the crossfire of his family's mounting tensions and conflicts. Harry Jr. had reportedly taken on a protective role toward his youngest brother, attempting to shield him from the worst of their father's anger and the volatile atmosphere that pervaded their household, creating a bond between them that made what ultimately transpired all the more heartbreaking and incomprehensible to those trying to make sense of the tragedy. During the Thanksgiving weekend of 1976, Harry Jr. had returned home on furlough from the Citadel, but his return wasn't motivated by eager anticipation of family togetherness or holiday celebrations. He had faked an illness to escape the academy early, desperate to get away from the brutal environment that had made his life there absolutely miserable and unbearable, dreading the moment when he would be forced to return to that institution of torment and continue enduring the abuse that awaited him there. The family participated in what appeared to be normal holiday activities. They attended a local football game together on November 25th, bundled against the autumn chill and cheering along with other spectators. They hosted a traditional Thanksgiving dinner, gathering around a table laden with turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce, and all the traditional trimmings that American families had been enjoying for generations. Harry Jr. had cleaned his father's .22 caliber pistol, a routine task he had performed many times before, but on this particular occasion, the act would take on sinister significance in retrospect. He had skipped a planned shooting range trip with his father, perhaps already formulating the dark thoughts that would soon manifest into irreversible action. Or perhaps simply avoiding more time alone with a man whose approval he could never seem to earn no matter how hard he tried. Ronnie had shown him drug paraphernalia at some point during the weekend, a revelation that would have infuriated their father if discovered and potentially triggered the violent threats he had made in the past about what he would do if he caught his sons using drugs. Then, in the darkest hours of the early morning on November 28, 1976, somewhere around 3 o'clock in the morning when most of the neighborhood slept peacefully in their beds, when the streets were empty and silent except for the occasional passing car or barking dog, an unspeakable act of violence unfolded within the De La Roche household. Mary Jane De La Roche was shot twice in the head while she slept, never knowing what was happening, never having the opportunity to cry out or defend herself, or even understand why this was occurring in her own home, in her own bed where she should have been safe and protected. Harry Sr. suffered the same fate, 2 shots to the head, fired at close range while he lay unconscious and vulnerable in the bed he shared with his wife, ending the life of a man who had survived the dangers of World War II, only to meet his end in what should have been the safety of his own home. Young Ronnie was shot once and then subjected to a severe physical assault before his lifeless body was stuffed callously into a trunk in the attic, hidden away like unwanted baggage. The teenager who had been involved in selling marijuana, who had clashed with his father's authority, who had shown his brother drug paraphernalia just days earlier, his rebellious life was cut brutally short. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of this entire horrific night was what happened to 12-year-old Eric, the innocent youngest child who had been protected by his older brother for so many years. Awakened by the sounds of violence erupting in his home, confused and terrified in ways no child should ever experience, he was shot 3 times in a desperate attempt to silence him. Evidence would later show that he had defensive wounds on his hands and arms, indicating that he had tried to protect himself, that he had raised his hands in a futile attempt to ward off the attack, before being struck repeatedly with the butt of the pistol in a brutal assault that finally ended his young life. Around 4 o'clock in the morning, Harry Jr. flagged down a police patrol car, appearing distraught and panicked as he claimed that his family was dead inside the house and that Ronnie was missing. Presenting himself initially as a surviving victim or potential witness, rather than as the perpetrator of these horrific crimes. Officers responding to the scene discovered the bodies scattered throughout the house in various states of violence, parents dead in their bed, the youngest son brutally attacked in his room, and eventually Ronnie's body discovered hidden in the attic trunk where it had been callously concealed. The murder weapon, Harry Sr.'s .22 caliber pistol, was found in the basement. Investigators also found $600 in cash in Harry Jr.'s possession, along with marijuana, raising immediate questions about his involvement and potential motives. Harry Jr.'s accounts of what had transpired that night shifted repeatedly, changing with each telling like a story being revised and refined, each version contradicting the previous one in ways that made investigators increasingly suspicious. Initially, he tried to implicate Ronnie as the killer, claiming his brother had committed the other murders in some kind of drug-fueled rampage before Harry Jr. was forced to defend himself. But when subjected to a polygraph examination later that same day, facing the stress of sustained questioning and the weight of evidence mounting against him, he provided a full confession to all 4 murders, admitting that he alone had killed his entire family during those dark early morning hours. Yet even this confession wouldn't remain consistent. On December 8th, just 10 days after the murders, Harry Jr. recanted his full confession when speaking with a pastor, now claiming that Ronnie had actually killed their parents and Eric following an argument about drugs, and that he had only killed Ronnie in response, either in self-defense or in a rage triggered by discovering what his brother had done. This new version of events painted him as less culpable, as someone who had only acted in response to his brother's initial violence, rather than as the sole architect of the family's destruction. The investigation faced significant criticism for what many viewed as crucial procedural failures that compromised the integrity of the evidence and created reasonable doubt about Harry Jr.'s guilt. Most notably, investigators failed to conduct gunshot residue tests on Harry Jr. or Ronnie, tests that could have definitively established who had actually fired the murder weapon and potentially corroborated or contradicted Harry Jr.'s various accounts of the night's events. No paraffin tests were performed to detect traces of gunpowder on suspects' hands, another missed opportunity to gather crucial forensic evidence. Additionally, Harry Jr.'s alibi, his claim about where he was during certain portions of the evening, was never fully verified or investigated, leaving open questions about his movements and activities in the hours leading up to the murders. These investigative shortcomings would become major points of contention during the trial and in subsequent appeals, with defense attorneys arguing that reasonable doubt existed due to the incomplete nature of the investigation. The trial took place in 1978 in Bergen County, where Harry Jr. pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, with his defense team bringing in multiple psychiatric experts who testified about his troubled mental state, possible personality disorders that could have impaired his judgment and impulse control, and potential brain damage from the concussions he may have suffered during the brutal hazing at the Citadel, injuries that could have affected his ability to understand right from wrong or control his actions. The prosecution countered with their own expert witnesses who disputed these claims, arguing that Harry Jr. understood exactly what he was doing that night, that he had acted with premeditation and deliberation, as evidenced by his cleaning of the weapon beforehand, and his attempts to stage the crime scene and hide evidence afterward. The jury, after carefully reviewing all the evidence presented during the lengthy trial, weighing the competing expert testimonies and examining the physical evidence in Harry Jr.'s conflicting statements, convicted him on all 4 counts of first-degree murder, rejecting the insanity defense and determining that he bore full criminal responsibility for the deaths of his entire family. Judge sentenced him to 4 concurrent life sentences, meaning he would serve them simultaneously rather than consecutively, but with the understanding that he would likely spend the rest of his natural life behind bars paying for the crimes he had committed on that horrific Thanksgiving weekend. Appeals were filed and denied repeatedly over the subsequent decades, with appellate courts finding no reversible error in his conviction despite the investigative shortcomings that had been identified. For 45 years, Harry Jr. remained incarcerated in New Jersey's prison system, facing the parole board on multiple occasions, only to be denied release time after time. In 2019, his parole request was rejected because board members felt he showed insufficient insight into his crimes and continued to maintain elements of the story that portrayed him as less culpable than the evidence suggested, demonstrating what the board interpreted as a lack of full acceptance of responsibility. However, in May of 2023, after serving 45 years behind bars, the parole board finally granted his release, determining that the now 64-year-old man had served sufficient time and no longer posed a significant threat to public safety. He was released in June of 2023 into a community residential program where his movements and activities could be monitored and supervised, beginning a new chapter of his life as a free man for the first time since he was 18 years old. Moving on. The second Thanksgiving massacre that deserves examination occurred during the holiday celebrations of 2009 in Jupiter, Florida. The Merhige extended family had gathered together for what they anticipated would be a joyous Thanksgiving celebration, bringing together multiple generations under one roof to share the traditional feast, exchange stories and laughter, and create the kind of warm memories that families treasure during holiday gatherings. Paul Michael Merhige, then 35 years old, had arrived at his family's Thanksgiving dinner appearing outwardly normal, participating in the festivities and giving no obvious indication to his relatives that something was deeply, catastrophically wrong in his mind, that he was harboring dark thoughts and violent intentions that would soon devastate multiple families and leave survivors traumatized for the rest of their lives. In the weeks before Thanksgiving 2009, Merhige meticulously planned the attack. He purchased 4 guns, withdrew at least $12,000 in cash, packed clothes for an escape, and even swapped his car's license plate to evade detection. Despite his isolation, he was invited to the annual family dinner at the home of his cousin-in-law, Jim Sitton, in an upscale gated community in Jupiter, Florida. Jim, a videographer for a local TV station, and his wife Muriel hosted 16 relatives that year. Merhige had met Jim only twice before and hadn't seen him in over a decade. No one recalled who specifically invited him, but his father provided directions. As the evening progressed and the family relaxed after their Thanksgiving meal, perhaps watching television together, or playing board games or simply enjoying each other's company in the comfortable living spaces of the home, Merhige retrieved a firearm he had apparently brought with him to the gathering, a weapon he had concealed from his unsuspecting relatives. What unfolded next was a rampage of unthinkable brutality that left 4 family members dead. Young Michaela Sitton, Jim's 6-year-old daughter, delighted everyone by singing songs, including a rehearsal for her upcoming role in The Nutcracker. She was a vibrant child who loved dancing, storytelling, and reading. A handwritten novel about a squirrel was found beside her bed. Merhige, however, sat quietly, eating nothing and appearing on the fringes. After about 3 hours of dinner and piano sing-alongs, Merhige excused himself, went to his car, a royal blue 2007 Toyota Camry with a rear spoiler, retrieved a gun, and returned. Without a word, he opened fire methodically. He shot his twin sisters, Carla Merhige and Lisa Knight, who was heavily pregnant, in the living area. He then targeted his aunt, Raymond Joseph, shooting her in the chest after initially wounding her shoulder. Her husband tried to stem the bleeding, but Merhige returned to finish the act. He attempted to shoot his uncle, but the gun misfired twice. Merhige then went upstairs to Michaela's bedroom, where she was sleeping, and shot her 3 times in the back, hip, and head to ensure her death. Jim Sitton later suggested jealousy over the family's affection for Michaela's performance may have prompted this, describing it as an attempt to snuff out the light. During the rampage, Merhige reloaded and declared, "I have been waiting 20 years to do this." He also wounded Patrick Knight, Lisa's husband, shot in the stomach, and grazed Clifford Gabarra. After the shootings, Merhige fled in his car. The victims had no warning, no opportunity to defend themselves or escape, no chance to understand why someone they loved and trusted was suddenly pointing a weapon at them and ending their lives. The scene that greeted first responders was one of absolute carnage and devastation. Bodies scattered throughout the home where just hours earlier, people had been laughing, eating, and celebrating together. Merhige fled immediately after the shootings, disappearing into the night and triggering a massive manhunt that would span 40 days and capture national attention, as authorities desperately searched for the family annihilator who had destroyed so many lives on a day that was supposed to be about gratitude and togetherness. Law enforcement agencies across Florida and neighboring states were on high alert, with Merhige's photo distributed widely to the media and the public warned that he was considered armed and extremely dangerous. The investigation revealed that Merhige had been experiencing significant mental health issues in the time leading up to the massacre, including possible delusions and paranoid thoughts that distorted his perception of reality and his relationships with family members. though the exact nature and severity of his psychological problems remained subjects of debate among mental health professionals who later examined him and his history. Surviving family members were left absolutely shattered, dealing not only with the immediate grief of losing beloved relatives in such a violent and senseless manner, but also with the trauma of having witnessed or discovered the aftermath of these murders, with the knowledge that someone they had trusted and welcomed into their home had betrayed that trust in the most heinous way imaginable. After 40 days on the run, Murhiji was finally captured in the Florida Keys, found hiding in a motel where he had been staying under a false identity, attempting to evade justice for the crimes he had committed on Thanksgiving night. His arrest brought some measure of relief to the surviving family members and to the community that had been on edge since the murders, though nothing could undo the damage he had caused or bring back the victims he had stolen from their families. During the legal proceedings that followed, Murhiji pleaded guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder, avoiding a lengthy trial that would have forced survivors to relive the trauma in excruciating detail and sparing the families the additional pain of having to testify about the worst night of their lives. He was sentenced to 7 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never again walk free, that he would spend every remaining day of his life behind bars paying for the innocent lives he had destroyed. The third case in this examination of Thanksgiving massacres takes us to Knoxville, Tennessee, where in 2016, a seemingly ordinary family gathering descended into one of the most horrifically calculated and grotesque murders in Tennessee's criminal history. What distinguishes this particular case from so many other family annihilations is not merely the brutal violence itself, but rather the cold, methodical premeditation, the financial motivation that drove a son to murder the very people who had supported him unconditionally throughout his entire adult life, and the absolutely nightmarish methods he employed in attempting to cover up his crimes and dispose of the evidence. 28-year-old Joel Michael Guy Jr., an unemployed college student from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, who had never held a job in his entire life and remained completely, utterly, and totally dependent on his parents for every single aspect of his existence. From his apartment rent to his tuition payments to his medical bills to his daily living expenses, traveled to his parents' home in the Hardin Valley area of Knoxville for what the family believed would be a traditional Thanksgiving celebration filled with turkey, gratitude, and familial bonding. Joel Guy Sr., 61 years old, worked as a pipeline engineering designer, a position that required technical expertise and provided a comfortable middle-class lifestyle for his family. His wife, Lisa Guy, 55 years old, held a position as a human resources administrator at Jacobs Engineering in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Joel Jr. had 3 half-sisters from his mother's previous marriage, Angela Crane, Candice Fink, and Michelle Tyler, women who would later testify in court about their parents' loving nature, their devotion to all their children despite the complexities of their blended family structure. Joel Jr. had graduated from the prestigious Louisiana School for Math, Science, and the Arts in 2006. He had briefly attended George Washington University for a single semester before transferring to Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge in 2007, where he claimed to be pursuing a degree that would allow him to become a plastic surgeon. However, by 2015, after 8 full years of sporadic course taking without ever completing a degree, Joel Jr. had formally withdrawn from the university, his dreams of becoming a doctor having evaporated like morning mist in the harsh light of reality and his own lack of follow-through. By 2016, he was attending Louisiana State University as a non-matriculating graduate student, taking occasional classes without pursuing any actual degree program, essentially just pretending to be a student to justify his continued dependency on his parents' financial support and to avoid having to confront the terrifying prospect of entering the real world as an independent adult responsible for his own survival. At 28 years of age, Joel Jr. had never held employment of any kind, not a part-time job during high school, not a summer position during college, not even a brief stint in food service or retail that might have given him some minimal understanding of what it meant to earn one's own living through honest labor and personal effort. He was completely, entirely, and utterly reliant on his parents for absolutely everything in his life, living in a gated apartment complex in Baton Rouge where his mother faithfully paid his rent month after month, year after year, while also covering his medical expenses, his tuition for the classes he sporadically attended, and all of his daily living costs from groceries to utilities to whatever personal items he desired. Former roommates and acquaintances described Joel Jr. as increasingly reclusive and socially isolated as he progressed through his 20s, spending weeks at a time locked in his bedroom with minimal human interaction, forming no romantic relationships despite his age and apparent physical health, maintaining no close friendships beyond one childhood acquaintance from high school who barely recognized the withdrawn, disconnected person that Joel Jr. had become over the years of self-imposed isolation and parasitic dependency. The Thanksgiving holiday of 2016 would prove to be the final gathering of the Gee family in their Knoxville home, though none of the family members aside from Joel Jr. himself had any inkling whatsoever that this particular celebration would end in unimaginable horror rather than the warm memories and leftover turkey sandwiches that typically marked the conclusion of holiday festivities. The family gathered on November 24, 2016, for their traditional Thanksgiving dinner, with Joel Jr. making the 600-mile journey from Baton Rouge to Knoxville to join his parents and sisters in celebration. But Joel Sr. and Lisa Guy had made a decision that would ultimately seal their fate. They had decided that it was finally time to retire from their decades of employment, to sell their Knoxville home, and relocate to a property they owned in Burgensville, Tennessee, where they could enjoy their remaining years together without the stress and demands of full-time work. More significantly, and more catastrophically from Joel Jr.'s perspective, they had decided that their nearly 30-year-old son needed to finally stand on his own 2 feet, that their endless financial support had become enabling rather than helpful, and that they would be cutting off the money that had sustained his lifestyle of perpetual adolescence and complete dependency. Lisa Guy had already submitted her resignation at Jacobs Engineering, with her final day of employment scheduled for December 2, 2016, just 1 week after the Thanksgiving holiday. The parents had discussed their retirement plans with other family members, indicating their intention to inform Joel Jr. of the impending financial cutoff during the Christmas holiday season, giving him time to prepare for the reality that his free ride was finally, definitively, and irrevocably coming to an end after 28 years. What Joel Jr.'s parents didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have imagined in their worst nightmares, was that their son had already been planning their murders for weeks before the Thanksgiving gathering, meticulously purchasing supplies with cash to avoid leaving electronic trails, studying methods of body disposal through internet research, and documenting every single step of his planned crimes in a handwritten journal that prosecutors would later describe as the Book of Premeditation during his trial. Beginning as early as November 7, 2016, more than 2 weeks before the actual murders, surveillance cameras at various retail establishments captured Joel Guy Jr. systematically purchasing the materials he would need to commit his planned crimes and attempt to dispose of the evidence. He visited stores including Ace Hardware, Home Depot, Academy Sports, and Walmart, carefully using cash payments and self-checkout lanes to minimize his interactions with employees who might later remember him, buying knives specifically marketed as being quiet and efficient, purchasing large quantities of household chemicals, including muriatic acid, hydrogen peroxide, bleach, lye, and drain opener, acquiring plastic storage bins and heavy-duty trash bags, and even buying first aid supplies in anticipation of potential injuries he might sustain during the commission of his crimes. The journal found in Joel Jr.'s backpack after his arrest laid out his plans in chilling, methodical detail, with entries that included notes like "get killing knives," "quiet," "multiple," and "flush chunks down toilet," not garbage disposal, and "douse killing rooms with bleach," and detailed calculations about body composition. Percentages: 20% fat, 20% protein, 55% water that would inform his dissolution strategy using the chemicals he had purchased. The journal also revealed the financial motive that drove these meticulously planned murders. Joel Jr. had calculated that he stood to inherit at least $500,000 from his mother's life insurance policy, and he had written explicitly in his notes that with his father dead or missing, he would get the whole thing rather than having to split the inheritance. Some reports suggested the total potential payout could have been as high as $700,000 when various policies and benefits were combined, representing a fortune to a 28-year-old who had never earned a single dollar through his own labor. The Thanksgiving Day celebration on November 24th passed without incident, with the family sharing their traditional meal and spending time together in what appeared to be normal holiday activities. The three half-sisters departed on Friday, November 25th, leaving Joel Jr. alone with his parents in the house, exactly the scenario he had been planning for and counting on. The murders occurred on Saturday, November 26, 2016, when Lisa Guy returned from a morning shopping trip to Walmart around 12:15 in the afternoon, carrying bags of groceries that she intended to put away before beginning whatever activities the family had planned for the rest of the weekend. Joel Jr. ambushed his father first in the upstairs exercise room, attacking him with the knives he had purchased specifically for this purpose, stabbing the 61-year-old man at least 42 times in a frenzied assault that overturned furniture, splattered blood across walls and floors, and left Joel Sr. with catastrophic injuries to his back, abdomen, lungs, liver, kidneys, and other vital organs. The depth of some wounds reached as far as 7 inches into his father's body, demonstrating the force and determination with which Joel Jr. carried out this attack. When Lisa Guy ascended the stairs, possibly having heard sounds of the struggle or simply returning upstairs for some innocent purpose, Joel Jr. turned his weapons on his mother, stabbing her at least 31 times with the same brutal efficiency he had employed against his father. Deep wounds to her back pierced her heart, aorta, lungs, kidney, liver, and vertebrae, with such force that 9 of her ribs were completely severed by the blade. Both victims showed defensive wounds on their hands and arms, evidence that they had tried desperately to protect themselves, that they had fought for their lives against their own son. But the murders themselves were only the beginning of the horror that would unfold in that Knoxville house over the next day and a half. Joel Jr., following the detailed plans he had outlined in his journal, proceeded to dismember his parents' bodies using the knives he had purchased, systematically severing body parts, decapitating both victims, and even bisecting their torsos, his father's body cut in half at the waist, his mother's at the knees. He then placed the dismembered body parts into large plastic storage containers, filled with a corrosive mixture of chemicals he had researched, and prepared muriatic acid to dissolve skin and soft tissue, concentrated sodium hydroxide lye to burn through organic matter, food-grade hydrogen peroxide, bleach, and powerful drain cleaners, all combined into what investigators would later describe, with barely concealed revulsion, as a diabolical stew of human remains. Joel Jr. had even placed his mother's severed head into a large stockpot on the kitchen stove, setting it to boil in an attempt to strip away identifying features and accelerate the decomposition process. His journal had instructed him to baste the remains hourly and to turn up the home's thermostats to 90 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit to speed up decomposition and, incredibly, to melt fingerprints, as part of his effort to eliminate any evidence that might connect him to these crimes. However, during the process of dismembering his parents' bodies, Joel Jr. sustained cuts to his own hands, injuries severe enough that he was forced to interrupt his gruesome work to drive back to a Walmart store at approximately 3:35 in the afternoon on November 26th to purchase first aid supplies and bandages. Surveillance cameras captured him at the store with his hands already wrapped, though he apparently did not consider how suspicious this might appear or how easily investigators would be able to trace his movements through these purchases. On Sunday, November 27th, Joel Jr. departed from his parents' home, leaving the scene partially cleaned but with abundant evidence remaining, driving back to his apartment in Baton Rouge while his parents' bodies continued to decompose in the chemical baths he had prepared, while the pot on the stove continued to boil, while the thermostats continued to pump heat through the house in his absence. The horrific scene was discovered on Monday, November 28th, around noon, when Knox County Sheriff's Office deputies Stephen Ballard and Jeremy McCord responded to a welfare check request initiated by Lisa Guy's supervisor at Jacobs Engineering, Jennifer Whited, who had become concerned when her reliable, punctual employee failed to show up for work without any explanation or communication. Entering through the garage using an opener found in the victim's car, the deputies immediately encountered overwhelming evidence that something catastrophic had occurred: an intense chemical odor that caused physical reactions, extreme heat radiating throughout the house from the manipulated thermostats, and the sight and smell of the boiling pot on the stove that contained remains they would later identify as belonging to Lisa Guy. Proceeding upstairs, the officers discovered a crime scene so horrific, so utterly beyond normal human experience, that it would require hazardous materials teams and extended processing lasting well into the following day to fully document and collect evidence. The journal found in Joel Jr.'s backpack in his bedroom laid out every single step of his plan, including detailed inventories of his parents' assets, their Knoxville home, with approximately $100,000 in equity remaining after the mortgage, their Surgoinsville property valued at over $400,000. Their vehicles, Joel Sr.'s 401k retirement account worth approximately $80,000 after taxes, and of course the life insurance policy that Joel Jr. believed would provide him with $500,000 or more if both of his parents were dead and he could avoid detection for his crimes. Joel Michael Guy Jr. was arrested on Tuesday, November 29, 2016, outside his apartment in Baton Rouge, with investigators discovering a meat grinder in the trunk of his car that he had apparently planned to use for further disposal of his parents' remains if his chemical dissolution method proved insufficient. He was extradited back to Tennessee to face charges of first-degree murder and abuse of corpses, crimes that would eventually result in his conviction and sentencing to life imprisonment without any possibility of parole. The trial took place in September of 2020 in Knox County, where prosecutors Leslie Nacios and Hector Sanchez presented overwhelming evidence of Joel Jr.'s guilt, the journal documenting his premeditation, surveillance footage of his purchases in the weeks before the murders, receipts connecting him to all the materials found at the crime scene, forensic analysis of the chemical mixtures he had created, and testimony from his half-sisters about their parents' loving nature and their plans to finally cut off their son's financial support. The defense offered virtually no witnesses and no real counter-narrative, instead focusing on procedural challenges and technical legal arguments that ultimately proved completely ineffective in the face of such damning evidence. On October 2, 2020, the jury convicted Joel Guy Jr. of 2 counts of first-degree murder, 3 counts of felony murder, and 2 counts of abuse of corpses, and on October 13, he was sentenced to consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Appeals followed predictably, with Joel Jr.'s attorneys arguing in 2023 that the warrantless entry into the home had violated his Fourth Amendment rights, claiming that he had privacy rights as a guest in his parents' home that should have prevented police from entering without a warrant. The Tennessee Court of Criminal Appeals rejected this argument decisively, ruling that whatever guest status Joel Jr. might have possessed had ended the moment he murdered his parents, and that the exigent circumstances presented by the welfare check request and the evidence visible from outside the home fully justified the deputy's entry. The next case in this examination of Thanksgiving massacres involves Christopher Gaddis, a youth pastor at Grace Lutheran Church in Chesterfield County, Virginia, a man who should have been a moral guide and spiritual leader for young people in his community, and someone who represented values of compassion, forgiveness, and Christian love. On Thanksgiving Day, November 23, 2017, Gaddis's home in the Ashley Forest subdivision should have been filled with the warmth and joy typical of the holiday, with the delicious aromas of roasting turkey and traditional side dishes wafting through the rooms, with family members gathered together to express gratitude for their blessings and enjoy each other's company in the spirit of the season. Instead, tensions had been building between Gaddis and several family members who had gathered for the holiday celebration, tensions that involved household dynamics, personal conflicts, and resentments that had been simmering beneath the surface for some time. Present at the gathering were Gaddis's wife, 46-year-old Janet LeBlanc Gaddis, who had been married to the youth pastor and presumably believed she knew him intimately, trusted him completely, and felt safe in her own home with her husband. Also present was her daughter from a previous relationship, 30-year-old Candace Kunze, a young woman who was spending the holiday with her mother and stepfather, and Candace's boyfriend, 36-year-old Andrew Buthorn, who had joined them for the Thanksgiving celebrations. On November 21st, just 2 days before the murders, Gaddis had shoved his wife Jeanette over what witnesses described as a relatively minor incident involving spilled wine, a disproportionate reaction that hinted at deeper anger issues and poor impulse control that would manifest more catastrophically just days later. He had also attempted to throw a punch during that same altercation, an act of aggression that was fortunately interrupted by his nephew, who physically restrained him before he could strike anyone. Following this disturbing display of aggression, concerned family members had hidden the firearms in the house, hoping to prevent any further escalation of violence, not realizing that this precaution would ultimately prove inadequate to prevent the tragedy that was brewing. On November 23rd, at approximately 6 o'clock in the evening, surveillance cameras captured a confrontation that took place in the hot tub area of the home, where Gaddis angrily demanded that Candace Kunze and Andrew Buthorn leave his property immediately, his tone and body language suggesting escalating hostility and irrationality that should have served as a warning that something was seriously wrong with his mental state and impulse control. Later that same evening, beginning around 9:40 in the evening, Gaddis began sending threatening text messages to family members, messages that claimed he feared for his life and felt threatened by the presence of Kunze and Buthorn in his home. These messages were later recovered by investigators, including some that Gaddis had attempted to delete from his phone in what appeared to be an effort to cover his tracks, suggesting premeditation and awareness that his actions would require explanation and possibly fabricated justification. His nephew, recognizing the dangerous trajectory of the situation and genuinely concerned about what might happen, sent messages advising that everyone should evacuate the house immediately, that the situation had deteriorated beyond the point where it could be resolved through conversation or de-escalation, and that removing everyone from Gaddis's presence was the safest course of action. But by 11:15 that night, while the family was gathered in the kitchen playing a board game together, trying to salvage some normalcy from the Thanksgiving holiday despite the tensions that had marred the day, Gaddis retrieved a .45 caliber Taurus semi-automatic pistol that he had apparently located despite family members' earlier efforts to secure the firearms, demonstrating determined intent to access a weapon regardless of the precautions others had taken. He fired all 11 rounds from the magazine, systematically targeting each of the 3 individuals he had decided to eliminate from his life. He shot Jeanette first, his own wife, striking her in the back as she sat unsuspecting at the table. He then turned the weapon on Candace Kunze, his stepdaughter, ending her life before she could fully comprehend what was happening or why her stepfather was attacking them. Finally, he targeted Andrew Buthorn, who in a desperate attempt to survive had crouched behind a table for protection while pleading with Gaddis. Buthorn begged for his life, promising to leave the house immediately if only Gaddis would stop shooting, attempting to flee toward the door in hopes of escaping the hail of bullets, but Gaddis pursued him relentlessly and struck him with fatal shots before he could reach safety. All 3 victims died from their wounds to their backs and other vital areas, with Buthorn sustaining 2 additional shots to his stomach area, evidence of the sustained and determined nature of the attack. Investigators discovered a loaded magazine on the kitchen floor where it had fallen during the carnage, and another fully loaded magazine in Gaddis's pocket, indicating that he had brought spare ammunition to the scene and had been prepared to reload and continue firing if the initial 11 rounds had proven insufficient to kill all 3 victims. Police arrived at approximately 11:30 that night following the activation of a burglar alarm, triggered either by the violence itself or by someone's desperate attempt to summon help during the attack. Officers found Gaddis seated calmly on the front steps of the home, showing no signs of panic or distress, exhibiting an eerie composure that suggested either shock, dissociation, or a complete lack of remorse for what he had just done. When Officer Frazier questioned him about what had occurred inside the house, he said they're probably all dead. Gaddis admitted matter-of-factly that he had shot 3 people, stating with chilling casualness that they were probably all dead inside, showing no visible emotion or regret about having just murdered his wife, stepdaughter, and her boyfriend. He attempted to justify his actions by claiming that Buthorn had threatened his life and that there had been ongoing threats over the previous several days that had left him feeling unsafe in his own home. He further asserted that the 3 victims had all came after me, and that they all ganged up on me, painting himself as a victim who had acted in self-defense against multiple aggressors who had left him. No choice but to use lethal force to protect himself. However, absolutely no evidence corroborated these claims of threats or aggression from any of the 3 victims. The cell phone videos, the surveillance footage, the text message records, the witness accounts from the nephew who had been present during earlier altercations, every single piece of evidence contradicted Gaddis's self-defense narrative, and instead painted a picture of unprovoked violence committed by a proceeding man whose anger and desire for control had escalated beyond all reason or morality. Officers discovered Candace Kunze and Jeanette Gaddis deceased inside the house, and Andrew Buthorn's body in the front yard where he had collapsed after being shot while attempting his desperate, ultimately futile flight from the house and from the bullets that were pursuing him. Gaddis was arrested without incident at the scene and held without bond at Chesterfield County Jail, beginning his journey through the criminal justice system that would ultimately result in a lengthy prison sentence. He was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder and 3 separate firearm-related offenses, facing the possibility of spending the rest of his life behind bars for the Thanksgiving massacre he had perpetrated against his own family members. On November 27, 2017, just 4 days after the murders, he was denied bond during his initial court appearance, with the judge determining that he posed too great a danger to the community and too high a flight risk to be released pending trial. The case proceeded through Chesterfield Circuit Court, and on August 15, 2018, Gaddis pleaded guilty to all 3 murder charges and 1 of the firearm counts, with the other firearm charges being dropped as part of the plea agreement. By pleading guilty, he avoided a lengthy trial that would have forced surviving family members to endure detailed testimony about their loved ones' final moments and spared the community the expense and trauma of a full capital murder prosecution. Judge David E. Johnson carefully reviewed all of these materials, examining the evidence that demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt that Gaddis had murdered 3 people in cold blood on Thanksgiving Day, and sentenced him to 100 years for each murder count. However, the judge suspended 45 years of each sentence, resulting in 55-year active terms for each count that would run concurrently rather than consecutively, meaning Gaddis would serve them simultaneously. With additional adjustments for the firearm-related conviction, the total active sentence came to 58 years that Gaddis would be required to serve. Under Virginia law, he must complete 85% of this sentence before becoming eligible for parole consideration, which effectively makes this a life sentence given his age at the time of conviction, ensuring that he will almost certainly die in prison paying for the crimes he committed on that Thanksgiving Day. As of 2025, Gaddis, identified as inmate number 1932379, remains in Virginia Department of Corrections custody with no reported successful appeals or sentence commutations that would reduce his time behind bars. On August 8, 2024, the Virginia Parole Board denied his geriatric parole request, with board members Lloyd Banks, Samuel Boone, and Michelle Dermeyer unanimously voting against his release, citing the extreme seriousness of his crimes and the circumstances surrounding the triple murder. At the time of this parole decision, Gaddis had served approximately 6 years, 8 months, and 15 days, which the board determined was woefully insufficient given the magnitude of what he had done, the number of lives he had stolen, and the complete absence of any genuine provocation or justification for his actions on that Thanksgiving evening. The case drew expressions of profound shock and heartbreak from the community, particularly from Grace Lutheran Church, where Gaddis had served as a youth pastor, trusted by parents to provide spiritual guidance and positive role modeling to their children, none of whom could reconcile the man they thought they knew with the cold-blooded killer who had murdered 3 people on Thanksgiving. The church issued statements expressing their devastation and calling for prayers for the victims' families, for the community trying to process this tragedy, and even for Gaddis himself despite the horror of what he had done. Subsequent analyses of the case highlighted alcohol as a significant triggering factor that brought out underlying aggression and poor impulse control in Gaddis's personality, consistent with his prior minor legal issues that included a 2010 charge related to intoxication and a 2012 assault charge, warning signs that perhaps should have been taken more seriously as indicators of deeper problems with anger management and violent tendencies. As we remember these victims and these tragedies, we honor their memories by committing to greater vigilance, better mental health resources, more effective intervention strategies, and a willingness to act when we see warning signs rather than hoping that situations will improve on their own without intervention or that violence only happens to other families and other communities. Click on one of the cards on your screen to see more videos like this.